My name is Greg Michalek. I'm with TCDI. We're really excited about this very exciting conversation today with our two presenters. The title of this webinar is Penetration Testing Beyond the Checkbox, How Hackers Use Your Compliance Requirements Against You. That is quite the mouthful, so we have a lot to talk about today in the next 45 minutes. I'll briefly introduce our two wonderful speakers. One's Michael Bridgman. He's the Chief Compliance Officer of Trust Company of the South. And also Bogdan Salamahka. I think I finally pronounced Bogdan's name correctly. He's a lead cybersecurity engineer and incident response engineer at TCDI. We are recording this webinar. If you have questions, and we certainly encourage that, please enter them into the chat. I'll be entering back in the conversation later and would like to take some of your questions, but hopefully this is a freewheeling conversation. Michael and Bogdan know each other, so we intend that, and we'll also do a little show and tell as well. So Michael, I'm going to disappear for a little bit, but I'll let you guys have a good conversation.
Great. Thanks, Greg. Good afternoon, everyone. As Greg said, I'm Michael Bridgman, Chief Compliance Officer with Trust Company of the South. I also serve on our IT committee and a part of our incident response team. I work very closely with TCDI for our penetration testing and our security awareness and making sure we have the appropriate controls and doing everything we can. Bogdan and Greg and I have had a lot of conversations over the years with me asking a lot of questions about penetration testing. And so we thought that it would be a great idea to take our normal conversation of me asking 100 questions and turn it into a webinar so that we can all learn. So I'm excited to be a part of this with Bogdan. So Bogdan, will kind of start where I always start in that, we know that we're supposed to have a penetration test. We order it from you, I get it back, give it to the examiners, I check that box and I put it in a drawer and forget about it, right? There's not much more to do with it, but obviously that we know that that's not the case. So can we just start from basics and let's talk about, what is a penetration test? What's the difference between an external and an internal, and why do I need both of those?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that kind of brings up a bit of a funny point there where most people they'll get a pen test done or some sort of vulnerability management. They'll check the checkbox, throw it in the drawer, and then review it again the following year, the next half of the quarter when it's time to do it again, right? So when you have, like, say, an external pen test and an internal pen test, I think it's important to first define what a pen test actually is. With a penetration test, you're doing literally what it says. You're actually attempting to penetrate into the system or the network or into someone's email box. It's not necessarily just a vulnerability scan. You're not just performing an automated scan to identify potential vulnerabilities, which, that could be part of the process, but what you're doing is you're taking it to the next step. And we have an example in-house here that we use is a vulnerability scan is taking a look at the bucket, realizing that it's a bucket. Okay, it has a handle, it has the shape of a bucket, it has sidewalls, it has a bottom. It looks like it'll hold water. It's a bucket. Based on our vulnerability scan, it looks like the handle's a little bit loose. It looks like there might be a little hole at the bottom. But we're not really sure though, but you should really check it out. Now with a pen test is we take the bucket, we throw it against the wall, we pour water inside of it, we'll pour cement into it, we'll throw it against the wall again, we'll kick it down the street. We're really putting the bucket through its testing. We're making sure that at the end of our testing, will it still look like a bucket? Will it operate like a bucket? And does it hold your water without it leaking all over the place? And water here, in this example, is probably gonna be your data. So
that's a great example of great way to frame that.
Yeah. And when you have an external bucket test or a pen test, you're testing the perimeter or the external facing attributes, server, services of your organization, company, website, whatever it may be. And the internal is when you're looking at the perspective of your security posture from inside your organization. And the reason why those those two tests are important and they're pretty different is because the external one is, I think, where most people focus on that because that's where like, hey, I am externally facing. I have websites, I have databases, I have all these things facing the internet for all of our clients, all of our customers, all of our contractors, all that stuff. So that's where we need to put all of our focus, all of our money, and all of our time into protecting. When in reality, the statistics show that most compromises, most breaches occur with a failure on the internal side. And that's usually a phishing email, someone clicks on the link, someone downloads something and they're not supposed to. And then all of a sudden, all that time and energy and resources that have been put into protecting your city, it's kind of like the story of Troy. You know, you're protecting your city when in reality, the threat started from the inside out because there wasn't enough security solutions internally.
Let that Trojan horse in. Yeah, and I think that's great. You know, we just recently did our pen test with you, and our external came back and everything looked good, and everybody focuses on that and says, okay, we're safe. But then when you gave us our internal penetration testing report, you noticed some vulnerabilities that, as you just said, if someone does click an email and gets in our system, here are some things they can exploit. Can you talk about what hackers have access to and what they can do once they get in?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So that usually depends on obviously the type of security that any organization may have. I mean, we've had situations where after an internal pen test, we'll find that hey, we have full domain admin privileges in this entire network. Sometimes even above domain admin privileges, which essentially means that even the domain administrators or the system administrators of that environment can't get us out of their network, no matter how hard they try. And that usually means we have access to everything, all your databases, all your files, and in some cases, most cases, your emails. So you definitely do a lot of damage from that perspective. But I think the key here in terms of like practical solutions is to look into things like defense in depth, where you're implementing multiple layers of security. You're not just doing the basics like email filtering, which is important, of course, but you've got things like the using the principle of least privilege, which means that a user that maybe spends or a user that maybe their primary role is to do accounting and billing does not have administrative privileges to install software on machines within their department. Usually that's already a violation of the principle of least privilege, since that role should probably be associated with like maybe the department IT head or just IT in general. So there's a lot of things you can do there. But yeah, you definitely want to take the approach of using defense in depth and then using multiple layers of security. Obviously, things like multi-factor authentication, all that good stuff. We can't stress it enough, but you'd be surprised, how some people are resistant to enabling things like that, even internally, knowing that it'll be good for your environment.
Fine, that's great. Every time I've said this, every time I talk to you guys, before my conversation, I feel nice and secure. Then I talk to you, and then I'm scared to death about the things that people can find out. Tell us a little bit. When you are doing a penetration test, you are basically getting inside the mind of a hacker. You're acting like one. So when you're performing this, what's your philosophy? What is your goal? What is your approach to how you're performing this?
Yeah, so our team here at TCDI with penetration testing, we take it very seriously because obviously there's a lot of implications that one of our lead pen testers, amazing guy, he has a lot of passion, with penetration testing, vulnerability management, all that stuff, and he has a hard time sometimes just accepting what we call accepting risk. So in an environment where you'll have maybe legacy systems or you'll have legacy code or systems that are designed to run for a very particular application using very particular custom code, and it's riddled with vulnerabilities, and sometimes the mitigating solution there is just to put like a web application firewall in front of it or put some sort of other mitigating solution around it. Whereas for him, it's like that's not enough. And in most cases, it would be enough, but I think the key here is to not only implement it, whatever solution that may be, to protect maybe some of your legacy systems or whatever it may be, but you're consulting with someone that has experience in this space, and you're taking advantage of their knowledge to understand how an attacker actually approaches these types of environments, and realize that if your system is legacy enough, if it's outdated enough, with enough persistence and patience, any hacker can get in, unless you've like completely unplugged it. So with our philosophy, we take a very serious approach. We follow industry standard methodologies, so it's things that are reproducible. Our results are validated by all the available CVEs and things like that out in the marketplace, vulnerability metrics, all that type of stuff. But yeah, our philosophy is that, hey, let's get in there. Let's give this environment a run for their money, just like any attacker would. Obviously with our pen tests, we have certain exclusions, so things that are out of scope, like denial of service, things that could cause memory corruption or permanent damage, so there's certain things that we try to exclude, because we want to not actually bring you down, for performing a pen test. But at the same time, we don't stop. There's an adage in the space of hacking and penetration testing, from an organization called Offensive Security. I think many are familiar with it. It's called try harder. And that's literally the approach we take, is that, hey, oh, you try to exploit it 3-4 times and it's not working, try harder. Try another 3, 4, 5, 10 times, and we'll give it a run for its money.
Bogdan, I think that's great. And something you said that stood out to me that we've had in previous conversations is you referenced the industry standards.
Right.
And probably everyone who's on this call who's interested has either read the CIS, Center for Internet Security Controls, or the NIST controls, the FIFIC manuals. Here, all the protocols and the security measures that we should take. But you said that our adversaries and these hackers are out there and they're reading this and they know it and are trying to exploit the very guidelines that we're using to protect ourselves.
Yep. Yeah. So, anyone can go and create an account on CIS Workbench and get access to all of the documentation when it comes to securing server, because a lot of, like, CIS Workbench, for example, it's a collaborative system. It's part of the community. You can go on there, you can submit papers, you can submit proposals to security to certain infrastructure. Like just yesterday, I was reading an individual's proposal for security for a particular version of Linux within a particular cloud provider, and it's very interesting because almost all of the technical solutions that anyone would implement to harden those environments are clearly documented in there. And it's one of those things where obviously when those solutions are documented and when you implement those solutions, they provide a certain level of security. But we also need to be aware of the fact that the bad guys, like you said, are getting access to this as well. They can see what you're implementing to some degree, especially if you're flaunting your security posture online, with the tags NIST and CIS verified, and some organizations do that on their home pages. To me, that sounds like money. To me, that's, as an attacker, that sounds, like you're giving me almost a roadmap to your internal security infrastructure. And the bad guys are doing this. We have access to some, say, less safe websites out on the internet, run by certain countries that talk about these security protocols and how to exploit them in the States, and they'll share knowledge with each other. I mean, it's a collaborative effort of them pulling apart these frameworks and finding ways to exploit the frameworks in and of themselves.
That is always frightening when you tell me about that. In our conversation, I know we've talked about that. Not only do they know our security protocols, but you have negotiated with ransomware folks before, and that many of these folks pretty well know what type of cyber insurance we have and know what the limits are. And so, hey, I've taken over this particular organization. I know what their cyber insurance is, pay up. I don't think a lot of people realize that they have access to something like that.
Yeah, yeah, it's interesting you bring that up because there was a project we did not too long ago where there was a client was a victim of a ransomware attack, and all of their documents were affected, and what we found out later was eventually that the ransomware actors had accessed a lot of their administrative executive documents that they were putting together in terms of their insurance, all that stuff. So when negotiations open and you start trying to decrease the cost to gain the decryption keys to reopen the client's data. It's a bit of a blow when the attacker is like, oh, well, here's evidence of your cyber insurance proposal. You have coverage up to this amount, so we want this amount.
That's
So
another one of those things. Don't post on your website along with the controls you're using.
yeah. So, you definitely want to take as many precautions as you can. Obviously, like you can't, like in the perfect world, the ultimate security is just to unplug everything. But that's not how business operates nowadays. But, obviously there's things you can do to at least, protect yourself as best you can.
Sure. And when we're doing the internal pen test, all those types of things are the exploits that you're trying to find those vulnerabilities and help us correct. We can't, as you said, unless we unplug, we can't have 100% protection, but we can do the best we can to mitigate it and let experts like you and your team go in and help us identify those before the bad guys do.
Yeah. Yeah.
Bogdan, we talked that what do hackers truly know about us, and what can they discover when they're jumping on the dark web or investigating, trying to get into our system?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we do have a little bit of a show and tell we can do. Granted, we won't be going into the dark web today, unfortunately, for all of our viewers, but I can show you a little bit of the mindset of maybe what attackers are doing to find targets, build profiles on targets, and things like that. So I can share my screen now, and we can kind of jump into this real quick for
Great.
5 to 10 minutes. Just share my screen.
Just for our audience, we're not going to pull up anything on anyone we know.
Yeah, well, unless you ask us to. All right, so can you see my screen, Michael?
Yes, I can. Looks good.
Awesome. So I think what we're going to do is we're going to choose a target. I'm on a site right now called Hashed. I think many people have already heard about this site. It's very popular. It's very popular as well in terms of the Have I Been Pwned website, which really these are a cumulative efforts of all the databases, a lot of the assets that have been compromised over time, and these websites take all of that data and essentially create large data sets where you can now search for almost anything in there. So to keep things, as clean as possible, we'll choose a target as to start. Some of you may have heard this target, but we'll do Tesla.com. And what's interesting here is that as an attacker, for reference, this service here, thehash.com, it is a paid service, but it's not like enterprise level money. For $5-6, you can get access to a lot of this data fairly quickly. And here, really, this really gives you an idea of the type of data that can be exposed as a result of various data breaches. So for example, here we see, this email address was sourced from a compromise of house.com. So house.com data, and then here we see that, the name of the source, the email at Tesla, there's a username associated with it. There's a hashed password, and usually these hashed passwords is a password like that's from a secure database. So it's not the clear text password, but with enough effort and time, these passwords can be decrypted and weaponized for malicious purposes. And then obviously there's an IP address here that's associated with with this record here too. And you see the hash password is pretty long. So here the key is, as a malicious attacker, or, or even a researcher, or even, CISO or security analyst for Tesla.com, they'd probably come in here and figure out, okay, where is this from? What do we need to do to secure a network further? Now, if you'll notice, there is an ability to request entry removal on this page. So the way this works is that you click this and they send an email to this record here, to the email that you're actually looking at, or the email that's associated with that record, and you can go in there and validate that it's you, and then thehash.com will remove that record. So that may be a recommendation. If anyone was curious, you can look up your own information on thehash.com and see if there's anything you wanted to remove. So the information from here can then essentially be used to create a profile against an attacker. So let's get a little bit more interesting here. So I'm going to search for Elon Musk. He is, Elon, if you're watching, I'm sorry. You can call us, we'll talk about this. So Elon, there's a bunch of records in here. Now, I will say that some of these records, they're probably going to be duplicates. A lot of these are going to be potentially just totally different cases, because I mean, who hasn't entered in Elon Musk as their name when they're signing up for spam email? A lot of people do that. You'd be surprised. So
Really?
yeah, some of these are just spam emails for random emails with random passwords, but they enter in Elon Musk as their name, or they might actually be another Elon Musk out there. You never know.
Oh, I didn't know you could do that. I didn't ever thought about doing that.
Yeah. So Elon Musk. Let's take him now and let's go to Ivan Pone. So I did a little bit of digging, obviously, earlier to save a little bit of time. And Elon at Tesla.com looks like a legitimate email of his. So if I do Ivan Pone, we can see here that his data was breached in Apollo. This data was breached in, enrichment exposure from PDL customers, from Flex Booker, James, Pay Here. Pay Here looks interesting. So as a attacker or someone that's building a profile on this, I'm gonna notice this right away. Now, what I would do, and what we do as attackers, is we're not limited to just what you see here. We have access to the actual raw databases where these records are found, which means that we can get access to the actual passwords that were compromised in this Pay Here database. We can, pull it apart, crack the hash if we have to, do whatever we have to do to essentially build a profile on you, build a profile on your most common used passwords, on your most common used email addresses, IP addresses, and then we can use other connection types to essentially spoof your IP address or connect to an IP address that's close to where you normally connect to bypass things like multi-factor authentication, bypass, a lot of fun stuff. So, it gets very creative here. So let's move on to the next thing. So let's say we have a profile on Tesla and Elon Musk now. Let's say we want to see if there's any technical vulnerabilities we can identify within Tesla that could potentially help us in getting a foothold. Either now, this is all theoretical, potentially get us a foothold. Let's say we were part of a pen testing project. So on Census.com, I can do Tesla.com, and we can see if we can find something on here where we can now start building a technical profile of things that are potentially exploitable, things that we can potentially use as leverage, or or information we can use as ammo for, say, a phishing email. So for example, you can gain a lot of data from these type of sites where you can then craft very particular, very specific phishing emails and target particular people within Tesla, and saying that, hey, I noticed that on Amazon O2, the localhost 8000 and localhost port 8002 server is giving me a weird error. That's the API toolbox. I'm one of the developers working on the project. Can you reset my credentials to this and this? This is my user account. And if you have like a user account, now you can, you could potentially gain access like that. Now, granted, I hope Tesla won't do that just up front, but there's a lot of information on here that's particularly interesting. Like if I go to MySQL here for Tesla.com, you'll notice that there's a number of port 3309 openings on some of these servers. And Michael, I mean, you've been in compliance, I think, or 3306. I think, you've probably realized that certain ports are probably not good to have open over the years, right?
Yes,
And
absolutely.
this is one of those ports. It doesn't matter how secure you have it. Typically, it's not the best practice to have it open to the interwebs. And I can say that in most frameworks, this is a fail. So I'll just throw that out there.
Okay, because I mean, and that's what the whole purpose of this is you showing, hey, this is what you're doing during a penetration test.
Yep.
You're going in and identifying these things for us so we can be proactive and increase our defenses to hopefully lessen or at least mitigate these types of attacks against us.
Right. Yep. So yeah, so you can, we can gather a lot of information out. Now, granted, the process of creating these profiles for targeting, penetration testing clients, and even from a malicious attacker's perspective, typically malicious attackers will look for the easy targets unless they're like nation state sponsored and things like that. If they're trying to make a quick buck, they're going to look for the easy targets. But yeah, you can gain a lot of intelligence from these websites. One more site I wanted to show you, kind of as we're, as I'm wrapping up this show and tell, is Shodan. Now, Shodan's very popular. I think a lot of people have heard about it. I think they've been in the news multiple times. Shodan essentially allows you to query almost any network device on the internet. And I have a couple examples here just to show you the potential implications of having your data listed on Shodan, which I guess not even just listed, but maybe having it listed in an unsecure state. So if I search this string here, and I won't maybe go into too much detail explaining what that is, but essentially what this is going to do is going to search for all records. So there's 28,000 results, fly over here, 28,000 results of web servers that are facing the internet that have open and accessible remote desktop protocol access, so RDP, which means that a lot of these are potentially either they could potentially be compromised. Let's put it that way. You can filter by country here. You can filter by ports. You can filter by organization, by the top operating system. So the fact that I see Windows 7 on here is quite frightening. But yeah, so this is something that an attackers would use, because I think the idea here is I've had a lot of people ask me like, oh, well, when attackers are targeting like zero-day vulnerabilities, how are they finding the targets on the internet? Like it's not like they're out there emailing people, be like, hey, do you have this version of operating system, this specific version that's potentially exploitable to this? It's like, no, they're using publicly available tools to potentially identify these targets, and then obviously they're running the exploits on it. And a good example of that, I have one here, for example, is a critical vulnerability that came out on VMware Workspace ONE Access, which is like a virtual workspace tool from VMware. There was a vulnerability that came out in April, critical. It essentially allowed full remote code execution through Workspace ONE and their identity manager. And using this string right here, you can identify all Workspace ONE and identity manager deployments that are publicly facing the internet on here. So you can easily click this link and access to that website in Workspace ONE, and attackers can then use this to weaponize their exploits for these. And obviously there's some concerning ones on here. I think last time I was looking through this list, there's some government websites and things like that. Now, I will say that any of the resources that's on here, this does not guarantee their exploitability. So as we're going through this process, as we're creating profiles against our pen test targets, this is really just a means of, hey, this could potentially be there, but it will take additional validation, because sometimes there's false positives, sometimes the service is deployed there, but IT has already went ahead and implemented a patch, or maybe they've implemented some other mitigation. And that's where I think it's valuable to have more than just compliance and more than just regulatory frameworks, checkboxes, but you're actually taking someone that has the experience to actually pen test your environment to prove either it's exploitable or it's not, and then it's documented. That way you have evidence that, hey, we're not exploitable because of these reasons, or we are exploitable because of these reasons, and this is our solution that we're implementing in the next 24 hours, 7 days, 1 month, whatever it may be. So very interesting stuff. There's, I have a ton more examples that can probably scare you and everyone else, but maybe save those for another time. But yeah, so in terms of, identifying information, obviously what I showed you here is identifying information from an external perspective. From an internal perspective, things get a little bit more technical because we have to use tools that, pertain particularly to an internal domain environment. We can, sometimes you can do something what's called a domain name transfer, for a DNS transfer. And that essentially will allow us to transfer the records in your domain name server internally to one of our servers, or, quote unquote servers that essentially allow us to spoof your domain name server. Now, granted, that's not always possible, but, we always test. You never know.
And that's the whole reason that you do it. Is this is supposed to be another tool in your toolkit, not, again, we're talking about going beyond the checkbox. Is there's a lot of valuable information in the final report from these pen tests that folks should be actively using, remediating, fixing these problems to prevent. I mean, you've just shown us how easy it is to go in and find out information about ourselves and our organization. So these pen tests are powerful resources that we can use to protect our firm's data.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we do a quarterly vulnerability scan. And we get those, and generally those look pretty good, but those are the vulnerability scans are just more of an interim check to make sure that there's nothing new that we're not patching that's not exploitable. But that doesn't substitute for our pen test. We can't just rely on those vulnerability scans, even though they are quarterly. That those pen tests really are the nitty gritty, the meat, the best tool in our toolbox, if you will.
Yeah, absolutely. Because, one thing that we find with our pen tests is we'll often find vulnerabilities that the scan did not identify. Because you got to remember the scan, it's automated and it's looking for very particular criteria when it's scanning. So sometimes what will happen is that it'll perform a check on the server or system, and it'll receive a result that may be off by one number or one letter, but it's still vulnerable. But because it didn't meet the criteria that the scanner was looking for, it won't label that as a vulnerability. And all of a sudden you have a vulnerability in your system that's unidentified. And that's where the pen test can really identify those things, because during a pen test, will look at those results and then we'll manually test it and validate that, hey, it looks like the scanner didn't find this, but we did.
Right.
I think we did. And that happens a lot, particularly on web application pen testing, because web applications are so dynamic. The scanners are often unable to identify everything as accurately as a human can, because with the human intellect, human logical process of how an application works, and and really it's the try harder aspect of, hey, we just need to pummel this thing more, because we found that almost every web application has some vulnerability that could potentially be bad for the environment, for the network environment.
Absolutely. That's, we've talked about it before. I'll get those vulnerability scans, everything comes back clean. Sometimes we can get maybe overly satisfied mindset, or sometimes we can get complacent thinking those things look good, I'm protected, and then we get that pen test and here's some vulnerabilities and things, and it changes. It's just because we got a clean report one year doesn't mean that the next year that there aren't going to be a lot of changes, and that you need to continuously have those done, because the bad guys aren't just sitting there doing nothing. They're continuously researching and operating and figuring out how to find new attack vectors and exploit them.
Right. Yeah. And that's one of the things usually we recommend that, if you're implementing anything, any new service, any new feature, you always want to do a pen test. Because even implementing a small feature into a web application, like another page or a new shopping feature or something like that can typically add a lot of more complexity than you may think. And more complexity means more potential attack vectors.
That's a great point. Imagine a lot of people who are listening to this are either compliance or risk managers, and anytime we introduce a new product, we're supposed to really look at what the risks are to the business, and looking at profit and loss statement, looking at what are regulations that we have to comply with. But sometimes the technical aspects and how that could be exploited into our systems, I don't know that always is something that's first on our radar or our checklist. So I think that's a great point that you just raised. I'm thinking about a couple of systems that new online features we are adding, and we're going to have to make sure we have those added to our next pen test, and maybe do that beforehand to make sure there's no vulnerabilities that can be exploited.
Right. Yeah, I think that's very important, and I think because obviously at the end of a pen test, you get a report, so you get some sort of output from us when or any pen testing provider. Hopefully, you get some sort of detailed report that can outline not only what was found, but how it was found, why it's important, the potential risk it has on your organization, and then a solution or remediation, and then obviously some recommendations. Because I think it's very easy from a pen testing perspective to say that, hey, you have these vulnerabilities, this is how you fix it, bye bye. But it's another thing to say that, hey, based on the pen test, based on what we've learned from your environment, using the techniques that I just showed you, or other techniques that I didn't show you, we can typically identify more specific recommendations based on your organization, based on the type of data you work with, based on the industry that you're in. That way you have a better idea on how to not only implement those checkboxes, like you said in the beginning of a conversation, but how to make them better.
Right.
How that way you're going above and beyond without having to necessarily spend more resources, more time, or allocating more resources to those things, because there's typically a lot of things you can do that'll help you be more secure without necessarily blowing up your budget or something like that.
That sounds great. Yeah, Bogdan, one other thing, just to kind of back to the basics on this, is when you're first starting out and you hear somebody's going to be looking at my system, you're not going to take my system down, are you? You're remoting in, you're navigating our system, but you're not taking our system down. We're not going to be offline at any point while you're performing the pen test, correct?
Right. Yeah. So we take precautions to make sure that doesn't happen. So sometimes there's exploits or vulnerabilities that are prone to denial of service, and generally from our experience, we have an idea that, hey, if we exploit this, or if we poke this vulnerability too hard, it may cause serious issues. So we notify the client and we document it. And then we typically offer the option of, like, hey, if you want to stand up a staging environment or some development environment where we can actually poke it and see if it actually does exploit and cause downtime. That way the client can actually then understand that, hey, this will actually cause downtime, or now we can, and if not, now we can mark it as a false positive and it's no longer an issue. Yeah.
Right.
So.
Yeah. It overall it's a fairly seamless process on our end, and get a lot of great information. And obviously, as folks can tell, TCDI is always available to answer questions, talk through everything with you. I have certainly learned a lot, both in prior conversations working with you over the years and in our time today. Always never ceases to frighten me, but always gives me encouragement to know that you have folks like you who are the good guys wearing the white hats on our side, helping us to protect our firm.
Michael, that wasn't the whole purpose. We didn't want to just scare you to death even more, but we do have a couple more minutes, and we do have a question from the audience, and I think it's a pretty good one, Bogdan, because you see a lot of these reports, and it's what are the most common critical vulnerabilities you discover in a pen test? Is there some certain vulnerabilities that pop up no matter what in a pen test, whether it's external, internal, some low-hanging fruit that you constantly see that hasn't necessarily been remediated yet from clients? What do you see across the board affects different types of organizations?
Yeah, so that is a really good question. Critical from the sense of, say, like the industry standard rating. Usually it's across the board. From an internal perspective, it's usually outdated systems. So outdated end of life operating system software. Critical from the standpoint of a vulnerability that can be chained with other vulnerabilities to cause serious damage. Usually that's things like insecure encryption, insecure transport protocol. So vulnerabilities that relate to the actual communication between the client and your web server, your web application or system. Because those vulnerabilities in the right perspective, they can be pretty bad for you. So yeah, so in terms of like criticality, it varies, but I think the real one of the ones that really stand out is just like insecure systems. It's really surprising sometimes how some systems on large networks will just fall through the cracks when it comes to updates and patching.
Yeah.
And that one system is now the bane of their existence when it comes to a pen test. So yeah, good question.
That's a great question. Are there any other questions? If you have questions for Bogdan or Michael, please enter them in the chat.
Yeah, there was
Go ahead.
one more, I think, from that one. Let's see, like if a customer is taking care of all their low-hanging fruit, what are some more complex scenarios they should prepare for? So, I don't know, Michael, if you had anything, but from a pen testing perspective, if you've taken care of all the low-hanging fruit, usually that's things like patching, things that you can typically control. Low-hanging fruit, in my perspective, is things you can control. You can control what operating system you're running. You can control what your patch management. You can control the type of software that you run in your environment. You can control multi-factor authentication. What you can't control are things like zero-day vulnerabilities. You can't control these vulnerabilities developed by nation states or these exploits developed by nation states against enterprise level systems, like what we saw a couple of years ago with like the supply chain attacks that almost happened every other month. You can't really control that, but you can mitigate the risk. You can implement, defense in depth. You can add additional layers. You can perform network segmentation. There's a lot of things you can do there. Honestly, it's like a never ending and never stopping target. It's always moving. But the cool thing is that the resources are available to be in a position where you can actually sleep at night, knowing that your network is secure, that even if someone did get in, there's still enough mitigations and systems in place and policies and procedures, and people are trained enough to know that, hey, if something does happen, we can at least contain it to a very small subset of our organization.
Bogdan, thank you very much for that last comment. I think that's a great closing comment, that you're not defenseless. There are things you can do, whether it's pen testing or other controls, measures, policies, procedures, technologies you can employ on your network and working with partners. So, if there's any other questions, please let us know. But overall, I'd say thank you guys. This was a very entertaining and exhilarating webinar from my perspective, but I'm sort of a pen testing nerd at this point. But feel free to send us or email us directly if you have any other questions. But Bogdan and Michael, thank you very much for participating today. And I know we could continue this again, and maybe we should do a second in a series. But thank you guys, appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure. Enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thanks for having us, and thanks for attending.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks.